webinar. We still have some more people logging in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's Title Topics webinar. This is ALTA's free 30-minute presentation that we offer each month to communicate important industry information with our members. I'm Jeremy Yohe, ALTA's Director of Communications, and today we will be discussing the seventh pillar of ALTA's title insurance and settlement best practices, which deals with adopting and maintaining written procedures for resolving consumer complaints. We had pretty good interest for today's webinar. We had more than 300 people register, so this is definitely an important topic to be discussing. Before starting, I just need to touch on a few housekeeping items. A copy of today's presentation was emailed earlier today to all registrants. If you didn't receive it, or if you registered in the past couple of hours, please email me at jyohe@alta.org, and I will get a copy to you. All participant lines are muted for today's presentation. If at any time you have a question, please use the chat box function, and we will address questions at the end of the webinar. And as an added benefit, today's presentation is being recorded. After it's processed, the recording will be available on ALTA's website, and the webpage is alta.org/title topics. Again, that is alta.org/title topics. I need to thank SoftPro for sponsoring our Title Topics webinars for 2013. Their support allows us to continue providing these educational opportunities free of charge. Now, with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce today's expert speakers. First, we have Terrie Miller, the Corporate Operations Officer for H.B. Wilkinson Title Company in Illinois. Also joining us, sorry, Terrie.
That's okay, I was just saying hi.
Also joining us today is Alison Gareffa, who is Senior Agency Services Analyst for Old Republic National Title Insurance Company. Hello, Alison.
Hi there.
Alison, could you kick us off for today's webinar and dig into the seventh pillar of the best practices?
Sure can. Thanks, Jeremy. I want to thank ALTA for putting on this webinar series for members. It helps all of us to stay close as things evolve in an industry that seems to be ever-changing at the moment. Also want to go over a few housekeeping items on behalf of Terrie and me. The thoughts, views, suggestions, and recommendations made in this webinar are our interpretation of best practices, and each company should carefully consider how it wants to handle best practices. Also want to point out that ALTA has recently launched its best practices version 2.0. Many of you have probably seen some of the emails circulating from ALTA on this. If you haven't had a chance to look at it or don't know where to find it, you can go to ALTA's website, alta.org/best practices, and then click on Title Insurance and Settlement Company Best Practices, and that version that's there is the latest. It's their 2.0 version. There are a few changes worth noting, and it was very timely. As Terrie and I were preparing best practice number 7, there were a few changes related to that, so we were able to incorporate them, and we can share those with you today. Our webinar today is on best practice pillar number 7, which says adopt and maintain procedures for resolving consumer complaints. The purpose, as stated in ALTA's pillar number 7, is a process for receiving and addressing consumer complaints, helps ensure reported instances of poor service or noncompliance do not go undiscovered. Consumer complaints is an interesting best practice. It seems straightforward and easy to implement, especially when you compare them to some other of the best practices, like number 3. But how it is used in business reality will be the real test for all of us. Let's be clear, the word consumer is in the name of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is designed to protect consumers. So if consumer expectations aren't met, this falls dab smack in the middle of the CFPB's overall mission. This best practice should be taken seriously, as it could result in Bureau investigations. And if the Bureau deems the consumer is being harmed in some way, it could lead to consequences. Another thing that Terrie and I gave a lot of thought to and discussed quite a bit was who is a consumer. So I just want to tell you how we're treating that for purposes of this presentation, and share with all of you that you should think about this as well as you move ahead to implement this best practice. We went back to Title 10, Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, Section 1002, definitions, and under number 4 it says, the term consumer means an individual or an agent, trustee or representative acting on behalf of an individual. We're going to talk about this more later in the presentation and how to handle that. But for now, I want to move on to the overview and share with you what we're going to attempt to cover today. What is a consumer complaint and why it's important, standard procedures for handling consumer complaints, additional resources, and questions. And before we get into that first one, I just want to mention to you that the CFPB has issued some communications recently that give us insight into, in fact, Jeremy, if you can move ahead one, there we go, that give us insight into CFPB's mission, where they're heading, and really further support of the importance of this best practice and of all of us getting it right. The resolving consumer complaints best practice is important not only from a procedural implementation standpoint, but also from a daily and operational use standpoint. Here's an example of CFPB's expectations, areas of focus, and priorities. This bulletin that CFPB issued, dated June 25th, 2013, is entitled, I couldn't fit it all on the slide, Responsible Business Conduct, Self-Policing, Self-Reporting, Remediation, and Cooperation. It discusses enforcement, and I'll quote from the first page, which really summarizes how this will affect all of us. Quote, this guidance is being provided to inform those subject to the Bureau's enforcement authority that in addition to these and other factors, there are activities they can engage in both before and after the conduct in question has occurred that the Bureau may favorably consider in exercising its enforcement discretion, end quote. Although there isn't time today to go through this in great detail, we can all say that CFPB is really putting industry on notice here, and how each of our companies handles best practice number 7 will likely be important to CFPB. To the extent that we can use tools like consumer inquiries and logs that track them as preventative medicine to ensure our own practices and procedures are what they should be, then this pillar is really more than creating just a log or a consumer intake form. Everyone should read and interpret the points made in this bulletin and in best practice number 7 in their own way. But one thing is clear, we can all use tools like resolving consumer complaints to improve on what we do and how we do it. So the bottom line is the best defense is a good offense. So now we'll get into what constitutes a consumer complaint. Rate-related consumer complaints can be broken out into states where there aren't set rates, and in those states, complaints could be made through the DOI or through the agency. This seems to vary by state. In some unregulated states, the DOI gets involved in these consumer-type complaints, but in others, the DOI would refer the consumer right back to the title agent. Each state DOI has its own culture and way of handling things, so practices vary among these unregulated states. This determination should probably be made based on the practices and requirements of your own state if you're in an unregulated state. In states where rates are filed, rating bureau or promulgated rate states, rate complaints would go directly to the DOI. And then there are other complaints that aren't considered rate-related, service or customer service in nature, an error that could potentially be a claim, an error in the closing process. And these would really need to be handled. If the agency is contacted, of course, you're going to want to look into that, but you should also follow the protocols of your state. And I'm going to kick it over to Terrie to talk about some of the specifics.
A lot of the complaints that come in can be of, various nature. A general complaint about general service, the service they receive from an employee, the fact that they didn't receive their closing figures on time, that there was a mistake in the closing that could possibly render a claim. Now, quite often, the one about receiving figures, you never know who's at fault. They don't know when they call, and obviously the title company is always the last point of contact right before the closing. So everything comes onto our plate often, even when we have nothing to do with it. Always remember not to tell the consumer that, well, I didn't do that, whatever, it's someone else's fault. Always try to make factual statements. We didn't receive the closing figures, or we received the closing figures at 9 a.m. It's now 9:15, and we're continuing to work on your HUD. We'll have it to you as soon as possible. Making sure that we document every call that comes in. Now, sometimes this will be determined by your actual office. If it's not a consumer complaint as to a service that would result in actual harm to consumer, such as, your closer was rude to me at the closing or before the closing, those are a different type of complaint. But where a consumer is making a complaint to your company, it's always best, even if you do not make it a formal complaint, that you're putting some sort of note in your file. So if something comes back later and you're asked about it, you know that you've spoken with so-and-so, you've documented your conversation with that customer. Notes, notes, notes. Always put as much as you can in an electronic file, because Post-its often get lost. Okay. Jeremy, if you want to move on to the next. Okay. Most important thing, the most unhappy customers are the greatest source of learning. You always learn from a bad experience. Make every effort to give the consumer a positive experience. When customers give you feedback that isn't positive, be ready to listen, be apologetic when they're upset, advise that you'll investigate further. In situations most especially where you have irate customers, which usually when they call, depending on how many phone calls they've made before they get to you, they can be very upset. Always try to remain calm. Always try to not interrupt what they're saying to you. Training your employees is very important to keep calm even when the customer is irate. The softer you talk, often the more your irate customer will calm down. Letting them finish what they have to say, and then going ahead and repeating back to them what they said. Now, if I understand this correctly, this is what you feel happened. You want them to go away happy at the end of your conversation. Unless absolutely positive of the situation, or the problem, do not try to resolve the complaint at the time you're on the phone with the customer. Try to take as much information as you possibly can. Resolving something on the phone often can lead to incorrect information being given to the consumer, not really fully understanding what the problem is with the complaint while you're on the phone. We always try to, we feel that it's important that you have a follow-through with the customer at the end. Always let them know what you're doing or what you have done to resolve it, the steps you take. Calling them, I've called so-and-so, we've checked on those sold taxes, we've contacted the county clerk, and they have now been redeemed, the money's been sent to the tax buyer. We actually had a situation like that where the tax sale was missed, it came post-closing, and the customer, the new buyer, is contacted that the taxes have been sold. Taxes were redeemed, they ended up being redeemed, but come to find out, the county doesn't send the money to the customer or to the tax buyer until about possibly 30 days after you actually redeem them at the county clerk's office. In the meantime, the new buyer continues to get contact from the tax buyer who is trying to proceed to get a tax deed. And basically, important to keep following through, letting them know what is going on every time. Even if you can never make too many calls usually to an irate customer, the more you contact them, the happier they are. Let them know every step you're doing and document every step that you're doing. Is the log coming up, Allison?
It's in a couple of slides.
Okay. Make sure that you have a final resolution with your customer. And in some instances, it's not a bad idea to send possibly a survey out to the customer and feel how they felt the resolution of the complaint was made. You know, were they happy with the result? What maybe did they think could have happened differently? On a side note, when speaking with consumers, and this is probably more from an E&O standard, if you have a complaint and you are on the phone with someone and they're telling you, well, so-and-so did this and so-and-so did that, try never to take the blame for the company or blame anyone else, which I already mentioned, but make sure that you do not say, oh, you know, our closer shouldn't have done that, or, well, that title examiner obviously made a mistake. Always be cognizant of the fact that you're gathering information when you initially talk to the consumer, not taking on the blame or taking on any kind of liability as to what happened. Okay. Logging the information, making sure you have names, addresses, phone numbers, details of the problem that the customer had, and have a point person within your company that those complaints go to. It's very important that they talk to someone who really has some authority to make some decisions, or someone you designate. Passing them up the chain, you know, they talk to the receptionist, they tell their entire story to the receptionist. Then it's like, oh, well, I think this should go to the title processor. Title processor gets on the phone. They explain the whole thing over. That is very irritating to the customer and continues to aggravate them. So having a point person that you send them to take the information and take the details of their complaint.
I think that's the next slide as well, Jeremy, so we may be able to, unless, Terry, you have any other thoughts on this slide. Okay, then just one more ahead.
Sorry about that. I was sleeping at the wheel here.
No, oh, that's okay.
No problem.
Also having a backup person. It's very important that if the person that is originally to speak with is not there, that you don't just put them through to a voicemail. Again, nothing aggravates a consumer quicker than not being able to speak to a human being and getting a voicemail. I always take it from if I was the consumer, you have a problem with your credit card and you're calling the credit card company and you have to go through 15 automated versions before you get to a human being, and then they put you on hold for 20 minutes. Always try to be cognizant of that when you're speaking with your consumer. And okay, I think that's all on that. Allison, you want to take the next one?
Just a couple quick words on this because Terry's covered it real well. The consumer complaint intake form that you develop, you want it to be a standard form. CFPB really likes things that are standardized. ALTA's best practices talk a lot about standardization, and you want to have a form that's designed for complaints coming in via email, letters, phone calls. Somebody walks in your office, hey, I happened to stop by. You know, I was in an area and I just wanted to tell you about my concerns on X. You don't want people to say, oh, well, they sent a letter, and so that letter went over here. Everything should be transferred to your standard consumer complaint intake form, and it should have information on the form that connects the complaint to the transaction. And there are some things listed there that you could consider putting on that form. I think we're ready for the next slide.
Okay, so categorizing the actual tiers sometimes of the complaints is important. Sometimes there can be a general complaint just about your regular day-to-day service. Didn't get something in a timely fashion. So-and-so was very rude to me on the phone. Title-related questions, escrow-related questions, which often can result in a possible claim, as well as title issues. You can either, have a division person that's taking care of that, or maybe you have one division in the company that takes care of all of the consumer complaints. But it's very important, again, to have those people that know that they're going to be handling these on a regular basis, and that you can follow through or send the consumer to directly, that they're not going through a tier of people to speak with. As I said before, consumers don't like to repeat their problem time and time again. And the suggestion that every consumer complaint actually be entered into the log. One thing that is always important is reviewing how you're doing internally. If you keep a regular log of, so-and-so complained, it took us so many days maybe to get these figures to people. Keeping a regular log of the problems that you have with files can be a really good self-evaluation or a company-wide evaluation as to how you're doing, how you're really servicing, your customers. So putting every complaint in a log, I think, is not a bad idea. Logs should be updated all the time with the status as you're making changes, as you're investigating things. I called the county clerk to check on the status of, the redeemed taxes. I notified the customer. Additional contact with the customer. Make sure you log when you've contacted the customer. And adding your procedure to your procedure that the management, as I said, would kind of periodically review, see what's going on, and possibly sign off on the log stating, okay, we've resolved these complaints to the satisfaction of the customer or consumer, or to the satisfaction of the management, that they know what's going on within their office if you have individual offices that are maintaining your complaints.
Another suggestion of best practice number 7 is to have a consumer complaint log, as Terry mentioned, and some information that you could consider adding to your log that you designed for your operation are things like the agent file number, consumer name, a description, date received, to whom it was assigned, date of last contact with the consumer, date of the last activity or any updated information, and then that status, things like pending, action required, resolved, and if it's been resolved, the date and a description of how it was resolved. With regard to consumer follow-up, as Terry mentioned, it is important to circle back with the consumer, especially when it's resolved. A lot of us think, oh, thank God, that's taken care of, but we don't always think, I should tell them. That's a feel-good moment when you can call them and say, here's the resolution, and we just wanted to close the loop with you. Thanks so much for your business. The consumer should always be notified. Again, these are just some suggestions about the log. You could also create a log that documents any contact with the consumer. If you're doing something in Excel, you could have a wrap text so that that row just gets bigger with the information you add, and any information that you want to document, not just the last update or information on the file. So just some thoughts as you consider implementing a log for this. Terrie?
Always make it easy for the consumers to contact you. Areas on your websites where they can send you emails. Remote sites, we have paperless closer where our consumers can log into, actually track what's happening either on their file and even post-closing on a file, what's happening. So, it's always important that they give them an email that they can contact you, a direct phone number. You want to make sure that they have access to you so they aren't, as I said before, going through a long series of individuals and or voicemails to try and reach someone to speak with. Another thing, the consumer complaint intake form that Alison mentioned, making that a fillable PDF, especially if you're in a paperless company, and if you have multiple offices, as we do, that way it's available for everyone to add to, so it's kind of like a live document that's always being updated for everyone to see what's happening on it. Because especially if you have that point person that's gone that's supposed to be handling this, and you have a customer or a consumer call in on that day that person's off, then the secondary person has something to go by to see what's happened, and they can say, I see, that Terrie on the 7th of this month called and, spoke with the county clerk or spoke with, your lender or whatever the case may be. So there's something there that's live that everyone has access to, so it's current information. And as I said, consider posting the complaint log, or I guess I didn't say this. I guess I just did say this, to be stored in a network drive so it has access for everybody. Sorry about that. Okay. Please make sure to check with your underwriters on what their best practices are. I think every underwriter at this point has kind of put out their own little interpretation or sample forms or information to guide their agents on what to do with this particular best practice. Sometimes this is one of the ones that it kind of falls through the cracks because we're dealing every day with the things that are right in front of us. We have to get that title commitment out. We have to get that loan closed. And it's more of a, we do step A, we do step B, we do step C. This is kind of like that follow through at the end where people call, they might not be that happy. You give them kind of a general answer and you send them on your way. This is something that, as the CFPB is saying, they're worried about how the consumers are being affected by everything we do. And so we have to continue to be more cognizant of that here in the future. Better Business Bureau, they do take complaints. There is an online source for people to file complaints. They're also an excellent guide for developing your internal process because they always have things on their website about, this is what we suggest. This is how you better service, the consumer or your customers. Okay.
I think we're
that's
ready
it.
for questions,
Alison, anything
Jeremy.
else?
All right. Well, thank you, Alison and Terrie. Very good information on how listeners can build a consumer complaint policies and procedures and kind of what goes into it. Because as you mentioned, Alison, the CFPB will be looking at how businesses interact with consumers. We have a couple of questions that have come in already. One from Mike. He was wondering if there's any resources for sample complaint policy templates or samples or any direction that you could give, Mike?
Well, as I said, I think every underwriter at this point has come out with kind of a version on where they think this is going. I know that some of the underwriters have actually put together sample forms. Is that not correct, Alison?
I can speak for Old Republic, and our agency services and administration department burn midnight oil to try to get these out for agents. It's password protected, so if you're an Old Republic agent, you just log on to StarsLink, and there's a tab that says best practices. And what we've done is put together some sample templates that an agent could decide they want to use. There's certainly information they would have to add to make it their own. They could modify it as they see fit. It's just something that we wanted to give to our agents as a starting point, because as many of us have found, this is a daunting task to put together all 7 of these best practices and tie them up in a nice, neat package. And of all of them, you know, number 7 is not by far the most challenging to implement. So you can certainly check with your underwriter. I know all of the major underwriters have some guidance out there and information to help agents.
And Alison, you mentioned a good point that these are kind of a starting point. And would you agree that they should probably be modified to meet each agent's marketplace requirements?
Yes, that's something that we mention in ours as well. And we also say that you should check, you know, for state law, federal law, and any contractual obligations, agency agreements, et cetera.
And as an additional tool that Alta is working on, in next month in August, Alta is hoping to release a product to help agents build their own policies on all the different pillars of the best practices. Moving on, Todd had a question about non-public information, how this relates to consumer complaints. Could either of you talk about whether or not this needs to be managed according to the non-public information policy when this information is taken in?
That's a good question that Todd asked. I'm looking back over the log, and I guess I would say I would have to, I don't have number 3, that's best practice number 3 in front of me at this moment, but if you're having that information stored electronically, if it's not paper sitting out on a desk, it's certainly more in compliance with that, but I don't think that it requires any type of sign-off from the consumer, as some of the disclosures do. So at the moment, I don't see any information that I would think can't, you know, be sitting there. It has their name and address and things like that. But the way that this is designed, the way Terrie and I kind of went through this today, to have it all, you know, in a paperless environment would certainly make compliance with NPI easier.
All right. Good explanation, Alison. We'll try and squeeze in a few more. We've already kind of exceeded our 30-minute time allotment. Scott says it can be difficult for employees on the initial call, you know, in handling the customer. Do you have any resources for training employees or on phone skills?
There is, I don't have it handy here. I can send you a website on basically dealing with difficult customers on phone calls. There is a kind of a overview of in a customer service related information that I have, explaining how, you know, talking, you know, listening to what they have to say without interrupting, maintaining your cool even when they're yelling at you, talking softer. Now there's also always that part where if people start swearing at you, you always have the right to say, you know, please stop, you know, speaking to me in this manner. You know, I'm trying to assist you, but always try to make sure that you're not interrupting the customer. I'll send that website to you, Jeremy, for you to send out. And as I said, it's kind of more of a customer service related and phone skills type of website.
Okay, thank you, Terrie. Kathy actually submitted an answer. It's a telephone doctor. She says this is an excellent online customer service training program. So
Okay.
maybe
that
Google.
might even, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Anyway, Scott, we'll follow up with what Terrie was talking about and see if that helps you out. Right now, I don't see any other additional questions that we haven't hit on. Oops. On the wrong slide here. If anyone would like to follow up, there we have contact information for Terrie and Alison, and I'm sure they'd be more than happy to help you out. You can also email me at jyohe@alta.org to get you additional information. All of Alta's resources and tools regarding all the best practices are found on our website. The address is there on your screen. And as I mentioned, today's webinar has been recorded and will be available at alta.org/title topics. Apparently we had, there were some issues with people logging on. Must have had a lot of people log on, so I was getting emails during the webinar saying they couldn't access the webinar portion of the call but could access audio. So we will make sure we can expedite the access to the recording of the webinar. As a heads up, our next Title Topics webinar will be at 2 o'clock on August 14th. And we will be addressing recruiting, talking about the need for new recruiting practices and provide tips for recruiting from within and from outside the industry. So be on the lookout for registration on this for this webinar. And additionally, we will be having another webinar in August to go over the updated best practices version 2.0 and the new tools Alta has provided to help members, including the assessment procedures and certification package. So details for this webinar will be coming soon as well. In the meantime, as I mentioned, please go to alta.org/best practices to review these documents. So Alison, Terrie, anything else to add?
No, really appreciate everybody taking time out of their busy day to join us, and hope that we can continue pushing some of this information out. And as you said, Jeremy, Terrie and I are more than willing, if people want to email us offline, to talk to people about this important best practice.
Fabulous. Thank you, Alison and Terrie. And with that, that will bring us to the conclusion of today's presentation. I hope all the listeners found today's webinar useful. Take care, everyone.